Grace and peace. I am Brian Melser, the Baptist Campus Minister at Drexel University, and this is Peace and Power Christian Fellowship, the peace of Jesus Christ to change your life, the power of the Holy Spirit to change the world. And we are looking at words that change the world, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7. This is our series about Jesus, the greatest preacher ever, and his greatest sermon ever, the Sermon on the Mount. This is lesson 3, and specifically looking at fulfilling the law and the prophets. We are blessed to be a blessing. This is video 2 of lesson 3. You can check out the first video, which talks about salt and light. This is the second video, and it's going to be talking about the law and the prophets, and specifically how Jesus has come to fulfill the law and the prophets. This phrase is found in Matthew 5:17 through 18. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. It's interesting when I read that. I think, why did Jesus have to say this? Why did Jesus say this? Why did he say this now? And I think he said this because this is what his audience was actually thinking. Jesus says some very radical stuff in the Beatitudes, that anybody can be blessed. And then he talks about and ushers a threat that if those who have been blessed are not being blessings, then they're ridiculous or useless, and God might do something about that. We move into this one, and they're thinking, wait a minute. He's called into question some of the major tenets of what we have always been taught is religion. He's thrown this all away. Jesus is saying, no, I'm not. I'm not throwing it away. I'm defining it. I'm fulfilling it. I'm actually interpreting it and applying it the way it always should have been. Bonhoeffer says it this way, and the cost of discipleship will show up a lot in these because this is Dietrich Bonhoeffer's. In the middle of this book is basically almost a commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. And Bonhoeffer puts it this way. It is not at all surprising that the disciples imagined that the law had been abrogated when Jesus made promises like this, talking about the Beatitudes. For those promises reversed all popular notions of right and wrong and pronounced a blessing on all that was accounted worthless. So his disciples thought he was abolishing the law and the prophets because everything they had been taught was contradictory to the things Jesus was teaching right here. But Jesus wasn't abolishing them. He was actually teaching them the right way, which folks had never heard before. Do not think that. Jesus says this here because this is what the people were thinking. Jesus has just called in question that faithfulness always equals blessing, and that prosperity is a sign of faithfulness. And then Jesus threatens that the Jews' chosenness was intended for them to bless others. Therefore, their lack of blessing others might cause God to throw them out. So two basic fundamental principles in Judaism at Jesus' date was the idea that if you're faithful, you'll be blessed. If you're unfaithful, you'll be cursed. That's the Deuteronomic principle. That is, in some ways, pretty accurate. But also the secondary and the corollary to that is if you look like you're blessed, if you have a lot of stuff, if you have an easy and good life, that therefore must mean that you have been faithful. And that is not necessarily the same thing as true. And Jesus is saying, blowing that all up and saying, you know what, I'm going to be here and I'm going to lavish blessing on anybody and everybody, even those who don't look like they fit into the regular blessings categories. the people that God is saying, that quite often the people who aren't godly, the people poor in spirit, the people who are meek, the people who are mourning because God may have done something to them. They've lost a loved one. They're grieving. All these people, the people who are persecuted, the people who need justice, all these people who don't look like they're blessed, they're going to get blessed. And that blows up this entire Deuteronomy principle that faithfulness leads to blessing, and that looking like you're blessed proves that you have been faithful. That blows that out of the water, and it leaves people thinking, okay, now Jesus is trying to change the game. He's trying to change religion. Maybe he's getting rid of the law and the prophets completely. And then the second piece to that is the Jewish people were chosen by God. That is just what they were. They were chosen by God. But if you read back through that, they were chosen by God to be faithful, and their faithfulness to be a blessing to the entire world. They were chosen to be blessed so that they could bless others. And if the secondary clauses of that are not functioning, then does God have the ability to throw them out? Jesus is actually asking that question. And both that blessing question and chosenness of Israel question are leading those who are listening to him to think, wait a minute, he's actually gone off the deep end, and he's actually trying to abolish everything we've been taught so far. But Jesus says, no, that's not it. I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. You got it all wrong. If those 2 points make you think that I've come to abolish the law, you don't understand the law. And this is the way, this idea of Jesus fulfilled the law. How does Jesus fulfill the law? One, he exemplified what it meant to live perfectly under the civil law. The Jewish law is sometimes, we try to break it into 3 categories, although those 3 categories are not very clean and they don't break easily, and they're all intertwined. So this is a 20th century or 21st century concept put back onto ancient literature, but he exemplified what it meant to live perfectly under the civil law. He never broke the law, so he fulfilled the law by living it. But he also embraced what it meant to live perfectly under the moral law by loving his enemies to the point of death. So not only did he follow the civil law, how to exist well in this Jewish people group, this Jewish community, he also the moral law, how to, how to love your neighbor as yourself. And he embodied the images and metaphors embedded in the ceremonial law. So the sacrifices and all the ceremonies and cultic rituals lined up in the Old Testament point to his being the embodiment of that sacrifice. And then, if you want to talk about the prophets, he inaugurated the prophetic hopes that a better world is coming. So, all the pieces of the Old Testament law and prophets have some sort of culmination, some sort of completion, some sort of fulfillment in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So, the life shows how you can live according to the civil and moral law without actually breaking it. His death shows how the ceremonial law and the sacrifices point to atonement for sins by a sacrifice. And then his resurrection will, in some way, in someday soon, much, a year or two down the road from the Sermon on the Mount, will show the prophetic hope of new life to come. So all the parts of this are fulfilled in Jesus's life, death, and resurrection. He has come to fulfill the law. Now, that is not necessarily something people would know. But from this point on, this rest of the Sermon on the Mount, and actually the rest of Jesus's ministry, is looking at how Jesus can be, how Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, not to abolish it, but to fulfill it. That's Jesus's big statement at the very beginning of this Sermon on the Mount. That is what the rest of the Sermon on the Mount will be about, and technically what the rest of Jesus's ministry will be about, fulfilling the law and the prophets. Now, question for you, drop down in the comments to answer this and to think this through. Seriously, think this through this week. What does it mean that Jesus fulfills the law and the prophets? How does that actually apply? What parts of the law does Jesus fulfill, and how does he fulfill it? What parts of the prophetic books does Jesus fulfill, and how does he fulfill it? To look at that is an interesting study. And if you have ideas, drop them down in the comments. But I also suggest you look at those on your own, whether you comment or not, throughout the week to really examine that question. What does it mean that Jesus fulfills the law and the prophets? Also, what are some legitimate questions that might cause others to wonder if you were questioning everything? And for me, and I'll be honest here, the pandemic, going in and retreating into our homes due to COVID, and the conversation around that about how we were having to put our Sunday morning services, our large group worship gatherings, on hold for a time, and the angst many of us felt because of that really raised up some already forming questions, and maybe questions that I've had for a long time in my heart, about the definition of what church is. And I call into question quite often, and will hear this in the language, how much of a question this is in my life, that our Sunday morning pep rallies have so closely become defined as church that we have no idea how to be the church without them. And they are, in my opinion, something I question, and just a very Western, very American form of methodology, of organizational methodology, that is not in any way, shape, or form absolutely necessary for being a New Testament church. Now, when I ask that question out loud to people, they think I'm questioning a lot more than what I really am. They hold on to that, and they have trouble imagining church without those Sunday morning large group gatherings that have been the definition of church for so long. When I question that, people quite often question whether or not I'm trying to throw the whole thing away. What are some other questions that could be in that boat, that if you question this, people would think you were throwing it away? And they're legitimate questions, but they're not necessarily bad questions. You're just asking a question like it. But there are some that, would say, if you question this, you're probably throwing the whole thing away. I believe that Jesus' resurrection is in that. If you question the resurrection of Jesus Christ, it's good to question and examine it to see if it happened. But if you question its importance to Christianity, you're probably going to end up in a differently defined religion that is not Christianity. For me, the resurrection is one of those things that the entire system is built around. And if you question that hub, you are questioning everything. So there's difference there. I question how we do church, but I don't question the resurrection and the need for a body that comes to ground and celebrates that. So hopefully you can see that those two distinctions there. As always, there are 3 ways to join this And for right now, the Sunday nights are via Zoom. Drexel's in virtual up until a point due to COVID stuff. The in-persons will be happening at some point soon. And then Monday nights we're also on Zoom, and then there's these weekly wrap-ups on YouTube and WordPress. Then always Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WordPress, YouTube. Those links are in the description. That's where you can find me on social media. I enjoyed having these conversations with you. Hope to talk to you again real soon.